Drake, a good year for the Big 12, an okay year for the ACC. Which conference was better this year?
The Big 12, far and away. When your 16th best team in the conference wins the league, but there are still so many power schools there at the very top, that shows the depth of a league. Arizona State, Camp Scatterbo, we can't deny, they were probably one of the top 10 teams in the country after what we saw them do against Texas, where they should have won the game. And you go down the list to BYU and how good they were, to Kansas State, to Iowa State, to the bowl game wins. And then the ACC goes 1-9 in the postseason, completely lays a dud in the postseason when your college football playoff team in Miami is losing its bowl game to a Big 12 school in Iowa State, a bunch of corn-fed boys from Iowa. And the quarterback, the excuse is our quarterback was a pansy in the second half. That's not an excuse that I'm willing to accept here. I think Clemson winning the ACC with 3 losses, that already is a tough optic. SMU, they paid their way into the league. They're not taking any money. They pay their way into the league, and they immediately go to the college football play. The same SMU team that the Big 12 has turned down for so long. How do you let a mid-major school come to your conference when you have brands like Miami and Clemson and Florida State, who went 2-10, by the way? How do you let a mid-major school win your league in the regular season and go to the college football playoff to represent you? That's just a very hard optic. And I don't think, again, nationally, everyone's talking about Camp Scatterbo. Like the Big 12 had their school that was a Pac-12 school who comes in and they proved they deserve to be there. And then SMU never really caught on that national star power. And so many big talking heads were arguing they should have been out of the college football playoff. Come to find out, between them and Clemson, neither made any noise. They'll hang the banner, but we won't remember them. And I don't think that's very good for the Atlantic Coast Conference. But TJ, you're a Florida State guy. And again, them going 2-10 is part of what mars that conference. Do you think the ACC is closer to the Big 12 than many are giving them credit for?
Yeah, I think overall they did have. I think that if you could somehow ignore what happened in the month of December, then you'd probably say, which you can't. That's the problem. That's the problem with the whole argument. If I was going to try and fight for the ACC, which I will not. Also, I didn't need the reminder on Florida State's record. But you're right. Like your most powerful brand was your worst team.
Yeah, exactly.
And they were the laughing stock of college football.
Let's flip Florida State and SMU this year. And we're having a completely different conversation, right? Yeah. We're having a completely different conversation.
Florida State goes to the ACC championship, is competitive, wins big games, continues on their path. They won 10 games 2 years ago. They won 13 games last year. They go out and win 10 or 11 this year, and they're in the playoff. We're having a much different conversation because we're having the conversation of the big brands. Hey, Clemson and Florida State got in. The winner got in on an auto bid, but they got 2 teams as opposed to the Big 12's 1 team. The ACC maybe should have had a 3rd team. Like, I could make the argument that Miami was just as deserving as Indiana. Then you're having a completely different. Miami just wins their bowl game, right? Wins that thing going away. We maybe look at things a little bit differently because of the way they flounder down the stretch, and not just flounder down the stretch in the playoff. Miami lost 2 games out of their last 3 to Georgia Tech and Syracuse. And I think the ACC had good teams. They had teams that were Syracuse winning 10 games under Fran Brown. Really good year 1. Duke coming out of nowhere to go 9-3. They had good programs. The depth is not there, and the way they completely floundered down the stretch, not just in December, but also in November, was very, very telling. Florida State, again, a huge problem with the league right now, both legally and on the field, clearly. But if Florida State just goes 8-4, it's maybe a different conversation. Their best brand, their biggest brand, their most national brand, being an absolute dumpster fire is terrible for the league. And then just getting into the playoff, a couple of teams. I think if you had this conversation on December 5th, we may have looked at it a little bit differently because we wouldn't have the data point of bowl season. We wouldn't have the data point of how Arizona State, Clemson, and SMU performed. Arizona State outperformed Clemson in the college football playoff. Yep. Now, Arizona State gets beat by 30. Right, which a lot of people thought was a possibility. Arizona State gets blown out. Maybe we look at this differently. But they played better than Clemson. They didn't get embarrassed like SMU did. They didn't have their best brand. I guess they did have their preseason brand kind of falter with Utah. So thanks a lot, Utes. But I do think that creates some of the narrative of, man, this wasn't a great year for the ACC. They did have the worst Power 4 year. In season, I do think that some of their teams did really well. When you really look at it, in totality, you add Clemson in, you add in what SMU did, you add in what Duke, Syracuse, some of these other teams did, but the ACC felt like they were just this close to being right there, right? Miami wins a bowl game to get to 11 wins. Georgia Tech somehow finds a way to win that 8 overtime game. They're looked at a little bit differently, right? But you look at it in totality, and the ACC just wasn't it this year.
No, and I don't think that we should be in well, one thing that does, I'll kind of close that note with, the Big 12 didn't have a major brand. We don't have a Clemson. We don't have a Miami or a Florida State. We have no expectations. If BYU wins the league, if Arizona State wins the league, if Kansas wins the league, great. It's all one and the same. There was nobody that had to win 10 games. Florida State had to win 10 games. Utah doesn't. Everybody's like, okay, whatever. Okay. But this is a wasted conversation to me in that, sorry, TJ, your topic sucks. This is a wasted conversation in that the Big 12 and the ACC can both agree that in combating the Big 10 and the SEC, the best thing to do is to promote one another and work together. I think each of those commissioners now understands, especially with Florida State suing the Atlantic Coast Conference, that these two leagues, instead of compare, contrast, and war against each other, the best thing you can do is join forces against the Big 10 that seems to be actually kind of leveling out from they got what they wanted, an expansion, we're good. The SEC is this money-grabbing, college football-destroying entity. Best thing these two leagues can do is combat that.
Yeah, and it feels like they've done that to some extent, right? The ACC certainly floundered there late, but they were very competitive in what they did. South Carolina and Clemson, very similar programs, a game that went down to a 3-point difference, right? And South Carolina gets it done on the road. Georgia Tech and Georgia, right there with both teams. Louisville beats Kentucky the last week of the season. Not that anybody's hanging their hats on beating Kentucky this year, but you look at the competitiveness of the two conferences from that side. And then you look again at what the Big 12 did, right? In beating one of the best teams in the country in Miami, in taking Texas to the wire in double overtime and maybe a controversial win. I do think that both conferences are maybe not right there, but they're certainly getting closer and deserve a lot more respect than ESPN, any of the national media, any of the talking heads give them. I guess we'll give Fox some credit. Klatt does a good job, and some of the other guys over at CBS do a good job of kind of raising up where the Big 12 is. But I do think that yeah, you're exactly right. It's not necessarily like, oh, we need to have this big fight about ACC, Big 12. It's where are those conferences in relation to the rest of college football? And it seems like the gap is closing. Now, some of that is conferences rising up, and some of that is the SEC coming back down to earth from where they've been the last 20 years. But I do think that's a big deal and a good point that you make.
A 7-5 Georgia Tech team took Georgia to 8 overtimes, took the SEC champion to 8 overtimes, and very well could have won that game at the end. They didn't, but they were right there and showed real grit, real competition. The number one team in the country for most of the year was Texas, and Arizona State takes them to double overtime. And well, again, you review it, and the guy catches the ball with the ground. We could have seen a call that changes the course of the playoff this year that gives Arizona State a win. Those are the cream of the crop. The Arizona State cream of the crop in the Big 12, and then Georgia Tech doing what it did. Those are things you hang your hat on if you're those two conferences. Even in games you lost, it just shows everybody here, hey, calm down a little bit. The SEC, calm down a little bit. You're not what you think you are. And when these two leagues are able to be competitive with that conference, it's only going to help college football get back to what it was, this ultra competitive, everyone gets the same amount of love that it deserves.
Yeah, Clemson just pulled, it sounds like, Penn State's defensive coordinator. You'd expect them to be a little bit better next year, and we're talking about a team that already won the league, getting a little bit better. Carson Beck, an SEC quarterback, chooses to go to Miami. You would think that Florida State couldn't be as bad as they were last year in the year upcoming. And so it'll be interesting to see if the ACC can kind of rebound after what was an okay year and make it a good year. And then you look at the Big 12. We've talked a ton about Kalani Sitake and what's BYU going to look like next year. What's Colorado going to look like with some big changes that they've gotten to their roster, losing 2 top 5 picks. And then everyone else that you just mentioned. What's Dilly going to continue to do out there at Arizona State? What does Kansas State and Kansas do? What does Iowa State do with Matt Campbell, a team that did win a ton of games this year? And so that's kind of what I look at is, yeah, there's a lot of good football to be played in these two conferences. How do they look going forward against this SEC monster media narrative that exists?
Yeah, I like 16 Big 12 teams, try. Like throw any Kansas State wins the league next year. That makes sense. Iowa State, okay. Baylor, bring a lot of guys back. Texas Tech, great transfer portal class. BYU, quarterback back. Colorado, got a quarterback in the portal. You just keep going. Kansas, there are so many. Iowa State's bringing everybody back. So many teams in the Big 12 that could win the entire thing next year. And the depth of that conference, it will be the deepest in the country, will only help the narrative that the ACC and the Big 12 both are relevant in college football. Today's show is brought to you by Rocket Money. Look, I'm 23. I turned 24 on Friday, actually. And Rocket Money helped me find subscriptions that I forgot about. It sends me an update every day with like what this week will look like in my budget. Like what I will pay for, what will come out of my Apple, iCloud subscription. That will come out of my budget this week. They tell me that. Send me an email with that. They've helped over 5 million users save a total of $500 million in canceled subscriptions as well, saving members up to $740 a year when using all the app's premium features. For me, one of the best features is that subscription tracker. I use it to cancel services I didn't know I was paying for still and that I'm paying for twice. With their goals feature, I've been able to automatically set aside money for my future, no messing or stressing, budgeting every month. Cancel unwanted subscriptions, reach your financial goals faster with Rocket Money. Go to rocketmoney.com/locked-on today. That's rocketmoney.com/locked on, rocketmoney.com/locked on. Visit Rocket Money and do it today.